Thank you very much. This is working. Super. So the premise of the question is, if you've got guidelines, then is the role of doctors just to follow them like robots? Alternatively, if you don't have guidelines, is the role a bit more like a judge, where although there is in theory a law, they ultimately the arbiter, and as you can guess from the contrasting images, the answer is going to be, well, I don't really think either is quite right. So that's the talk in a nutshell. I'm going to say four things basically. The first is I'm going to talk a bit about the ambivalence about medical guidelines. The fact there is a conference like this indicates that there is ambivalence, in attitude of medicine towards guidelines. I'm going to introduce what I call the inquiry thesis, which is a theory about what medicine is. So, kind of big picture. I'm going to propose medical cosmopolitanism, which is a theory about what we should think of medicine, so also big picture. And I think that thinking about what medicine is, sorry, I've got a long-standing cough, and thinking about what attitude we should have towards it is helpful for saying about guidelines, and then finally what it is doctors do. So just by way of background, I mentioned this yesterday, on the train on the way down, I myself was putting together a bunch of guidelines for a different purpose. Horrible document, it's 25 pages or something, and these things tend to be hated. So why do it? In a different context, performance management. But I think there are some general reasons for having guidelines, and some of them are more admissible than others. You don't want to omit some. So they're supposed to improve specific outcomes. Having guidelines in any context, not just medicine, is supposed to improve certain outcomes that you want to improve by telling people how to get to those outcomes in case they didn't know. Also, perhaps fairness. And we haven't talked about this really, but there's another function in the medical context as well. Two people come and maybe doctors would unfairly allocate resources. If it's not necessarily about achieving the best outcome, it's about giving people a fair chance at an outcome. So, saving the kidney for the younger person. We mentioned race and so forth, and that in South African context, you can see how those sorts of things, guidelines have an important fairness role to play. Then perhaps a little less commonly cited again is accountability. We have talked about this. It determines guidelines do play a role in determining who's accountable and when, and whether somebody's acted properly or not when they've discharged a duty of care. They do play some role in that, some role. And finally, I mentioned this in question yesterday, they exert control. I mean, the reason as a dean, one of the reasons I put guidelines out is because I don't want people making their own jobs up. I'm supposed to, I want them to do what I want them to do. And that's of course why they're resented as well, because people would much prefer to do what they want to do themselves. And I suggest in medicine something similar is the case. So these are the most commonly cited, I think. Control is less the commonly cited, but it's there. So in medicine, we do want to improve outcomes with guidelines. Guidelines are intended to improve fairness, and they do increase control. And medicine has massive. Obviously, everybody knows about the history of medicine. It's become a public concern, and it used to be a private concern. Historically, it was a private concern in the West and in most places. It was about the doctor and the private physician and the client, and that the role of the state in medicine has exploded. And so the people exerting the control typically are state through guidelines. And as I said, so I was pleased to see Bola mentioned earlier, it does, as we heard, erode the previously accepted test of medical negligence, whether a duty of care has been met, which is the Bolam test, which is that a group of a reasonable group of reasonable professionals would have done the same thing as you did, where that can be quite a small group, and it can be your buddy that you just rang up and said, look, will you just testify? And the history of that is that the law was not going to interfere with the medical profession, not going to interfere with medical judgment. And that models itself on the fact that the medical judgments themselves are supposed to have weight, and the attitude of the profession inwardly, I would suggest, is to itself is reflected in the Bolam test, and that is altered by the idea of having guidelines. So there's tension about guidelines because they're not justified fully justified, not fully justified by the overt goals. The overt goals don't quite add up. And the covert goals are detected and resented. So they are implicit predictions, guidelines about what's going to happen. And as such, they're manifestly incomplete. They're going to be incomplete because the situations that you encounter in the clinic can't all be predicted. So they will omit exceptions. Therefore, a strict approach is obviously wrong, but a lax approach is pointless. If you could just choose when to deviate. So the covert goals of improving outcomes, the overt goals of improving outcomes don't really justify either a strict or a mild approach to guidelines. So I have them, and yet we do have them, and that's partly because of the covert goals, I suggest. And those are resented. Doctors have historically strongly resisted external accountability. I'm not saying that's right or wrong, it's just what's happened. And as I said, the professional structure of medicine retains, to some extent EBM can be seen as an attack on this, but it retains a central role for expert opinion, and as was mentioned earlier today, and in fact, Samantha mentioned this as well, cookbook medicine, if a doctor just follows a recipe, as it were, they're not thereby discharging their duty of care. They've got to apply themselves in a more engaged way than that. I think pretty much every doctor and every patient would expect that. And of course, patients believe they're unique, historically and contemporary. So, so that's by way of trying to sketch what I make of the tension about guidelines. And I'm going to try and understand better why there is a tension there. And I'm going to do that by asking what medicine is, and I'm going to propose an attitude towards medicine, both of which, what I think medicine is and the attitude I think we should have towards it, leave an uncomfortable role for guidelines. Not none, but a complicated role. But this is what I want to reject first, which is a view of what medicine is called the curative thesis, which is that it's the sustained, organised effort to heal the sick, or prevent disease if you want. That's not really important here. So on this view, the goal of medicine is cure, and the core business of medicine is also cure. This is compressed. I just finished a book. I've got one chapter on this and one chapter on this. So if it seems compressed, then I invite you to read the book. Historically, medicine is terrible at cure, and I'm going to just give you this argument because I like it. So, the curative thesis as a description of medicine seems wrong. It doesn't seem to me that both the goal of medicine and the core business of medicine is cure. I think the goal is cure, broadly speaking. But I'm impressed by this. Roy Porter, the historian, says, I say here, and we'll say many times again, I'm not sure he did say many times again, but anyway, it sounds good, that the prominence of medicine is lain only in small measure in its ability to make the sick well. This was always true and remains so today, and I find that very intriguing. Imagine if, and apologies for people who've seen this slide in Toronto, imagine if, taxi drivers, you get into a taxi and the taxi driver, and you say, I want to go to the station, the taxi driver says, sorry, I can't do that. We can take you to the other side of town, we can take you to Catherine's College, we can't do the station. I can, however, suggest you get a good pair of running shoes, and that'll be £5, please. And then you get out and pay £5, buy the running shoes, and walk to the station. Or imagine, that would be very strange. Imagine also historically if blacksmiths just threw lumps of metal into the fire, hammered them randomly, took them out, and sometimes they were misshapen. Sometimes you got a horseshoe, sometimes you didn't. But despite that, there was a royal blacksmith, and there was a professional guild of blacksmiths, and I suggest the situation in medicine is historically is a bit like that. There's been incredible. The profession has been held in high esteem, despite not being terribly good at cure, and that I think is hard to explain if its core business is cure. So to formalise that argument, if the core business of medicine, not the goal, the core business, the thing it does, were to heal the sick, then medical traditions that were unable to reliably heal the sick wouldn't persist. If that were its core business, if the core business of taxis is taking you where you want to go and they don't take you where you want to go, taxis are not going to persist. But they do persist. Medical traditions do persist, despite this. So it's not the case the core business of medicine is to heal the sick. And I have a lot of defense of these things, but very briefly, it seems that ineffective medicine was very common before the 20th century in the West. Picture of a doctor next to child's bed and understanding what's going on by this stage, but not really able to do anything about it. So there's ineffective contemporary, and there's also ineffective contemporary mainstream medicine. I mean, antidepressants or whatever, not particularly, they are somewhat effective, but not that effective. But we still recognize psychiatrists as a kind of expert. We still recognize orthopedic surgeons as experts on the spine, even though they're not particularly successful at doing anything about backache. And there's ineffective non-mainstream. So there's various kinds of non-mainstream medicine, in this case veterinary sciences, crystals on a cat, and there's various kinds. I don't want to denigrate, but I don't think there's a strong argument that as a complete system, any other system of medicine is the answer. So there might be some specifics. I'm quite open to that idea, and there might be some value in various other traditions, both different parts of the world. But I don't think you can say, well, okay, we got it wrong, but Chinese medicine is where it's at. I don't think there's a strong basis for saying that. So this is what I had up before. So what is it? What is medicine then? If the argument from the persistence of ineffective medicine works, well, I suggest it's an inquiry into the nature of causes of the nature and causes of health and disease for the purpose of cure and prevention. So the purpose, the goal, is the same as for the curative thesis. The goal is cure. But what it actually does, its core business, what it actually does is inquiry. And we want cure, but if we don't get cure, we're still we're not going to deny that somebody is a doctor merely because they can't cure us. So long as we feel they're meaningfully engaging in or meaningfully engaging us with a tradition of inquiry into the nature of and the causes of health and disease. And I think this explains how you can have medicine persisting despite curative failure, and why we continue to recognize expertise even where we don't have dramatic successes in Western medicine. So on this view, on the curative thesis, guidelines would be justified as far as they're effective and perhaps as far as they're fair. And then control will be justified if it served those purposes, and accountability is likewise justified if it serves those purposes. But on the inquiry thesis, it's more complicated because the idea of a guideline shortcuts the method, as it were, that medicine itself has settled on for pursuing. On the inquiry thesis, it's a claim about the nature of medicine, which is thicker than just saying it's just trying to get to cure. It's saying it's trying to get to cure by doing a certain thing, and that distinguishes medicine from a nice cup of tea brought to you by a relative, and go to bed, and helpful and soothing advice, which might be curative in some sense, but it's not medical, and I suggest that's the distinction. Guidelines can be useful, obviously, but they can also shortcut the nature of medicine. They can shortcut medicine's own idea about how it's going to get to its goal, but by subverting, potentially, not saying they necessarily, but by subverting inquiry, and likewise the control and accountability roles that guidelines play could prevent a meaningful engagement because they could foreclose certain possibilities. So that's if the inquiry thesis about medicine is correct, what I'm suggesting is that would perhaps explain some of the ambivalence that the profession feels about just the very idea of guidelines. What should we? And the second question I want to ask is what we should think of it. What should we think of medicine? Thumbs up, thumbs down, more or less. The old approach to medicine, I suggest, and this is very much glossing it, obviously, the old approach roughly is trust the doctor, trust the young doctor. The evidence-based medicine approach is not that. It's trust the evidence-based bits, and the doctor and the patient become a kind of team, looking at the evidence, guiding each other with whatever bits of knowledge they happen to have, both being open-minded, but ultimately you trust the evidence-based bits. Jacob Sigenga has a nihilist, medical nihilist view where he basically accepts a lot of evidence-based medicine. He accepts that those standards that evidence-based medicine has, you've got to satisfy those standards. He then just goes on to say that in practice they're very rarely met. And so really you rarely have a good reason, you really often don't have a good reason to trust, to believe that an intervention is going to work. And there's a relativist view which just says, look, whatever works for you, whatever floats your boat. And perhaps it's a Foucauldian view. I don't know enough about Foucault, but one way of getting to this is say, look, really medicine is about control. It's about, the man in the white coat telling the woman how she's going to have her baby or whatever. And that is a line about medicine, and that's a stance you can take. I've got 5 minutes here. So the view that I advocate, I'm not going to go to each of those, which has its pros and cons. The view that I advocate, which I think is compatible with evidence-based medicine, is medical cosmopolitanism. I get cosmopolitanism from Kwame Anthony Appiah, who's a Ghanaian British philosopher, was at Princeton, who wrote a book called Cosmopolitanism. And I'm trying to apply that to medicine. And he doesn't do this, but I distinguish 4 elements of cosmopolitanism to make it a bit clearer. And the first is a metaphysical element, which is just realism, and he's clear about this in his book. Where you have a debate, a clash between cultures or whatever, there's a fact of the matter, and I think it's very plausible in medicine. If you have, in South Africa we have a lot of discussions about decolonization of knowledge, and what do you do with that in the medical curriculum? And I think it's very clear in medicine that at the end of the day, if you've got a sick child, cultural stuff isn't what people are concerned about. What you want is for your sick child to be better, and there's a kind of common universal human experience about being sick or having a loved one sick, which means that whatever your metaphysical views, it's very plausible to me that realism is the right attitude to have about at least serious medical matters. Whether something works or not, I think is basically a shared human experience, in my view. But then you couple that with epistemic humility, which is openness to revising one's belief in the light of new evidence. And that sounds very plausible, but I think it really does have to be humility. So, most of our evidence, even in evidence-based medicine, it's actually testimony of evidence. It's evidence-based medicine is, for most people, unless you've done the trial yourself, it's medicine based on the testimony of evidence. And because almost all the evidence we get is actually testimonial in its direct form, that means you've got to be open to listening to other people, because in the form in which it's delivered, it is testimonial. I could tell you there's a fantastic trial. I might be lying. So even if the trial is great, the fact is that what you're getting is testimonial evidence. So there's a sense in which whatever evidence comes through, you've got to take it to some extent seriously. And conversation is a central value in cosmopolitanism, and it resonates nicely with the discussions of dialogue earlier as well, I think. I don't think the moral thing is so important here, but the idea here is that individual humans have equal moral worth. And then this is important, which is the primacy of practice. And I think this too is important in the guideline context. Appiah argues very convincingly that you can agree much more easily about what's right and wrong. He's thinking about ethics. He's thinking what's right and wrong in particular cases than you can in general. So you can agree that it's wrong to treat a certain child a certain way or something, but disagree about why. And if you start with the principles, you're more likely to disagree than if you start with the cases, he suggests. And I think it's, in my experience, I think it's true. I don't have an argument for it, but it does seem to me true. And I would suggest that maybe one of the difficulties with guidelines is that they somewhat play the role of principles here. So, a cosmopolitan approach to guidelines. I don't think there is any getting away from guidelines. I don't think they're a bad thing in themselves. I'm not suggesting that at all. But the way they're implemented and used matters, as it does with performance management guidelines. I'm going through a whole process with these guidelines I've written. I sent it to the heads of department this week. When I get back, I'm going to go and meet everybody in the faculty. I've got a workshop 2 days in case people can't make it. I'm going to explain why, actually this is a fair requirement, and even though you didn't publish anything last year, you really should this year, and so forth. But if I just send it out, there'll be a mutiny. And I think this is well understood in the medical context. And for the medical cosmopolitan, guidelines would be helpful to the extent that they assist with the swift and clear dissemination of knowledge. They help the doctor to improve outcomes. They guide the doctor to be fairer. All fair. But they would be dangerous if they forestalled or inhibited conversation. The guideline says. Since conversation, on the cosmopolitan view, is the primary tool for furthering understanding. And that's why it's a fit for the inquiry thesis. And they would also be problematic if they excluded epistemic humility. Well, I'm not going to listen to you because this is what the guidelines say. They may contravene, it will be difficult, they will be problematic if they contravene the primacy of practice. we're going to argue about the guidelines. We don't disagree about any of the actual cases. Well, of course, I agree about that case, but we have a whole conference on guidelines. Nobody's actually disagreeing about cases. If that situation arises, then there's a problem with them on the cosmopolitan view. So, finally, neither judges nor robots. Trying to explain the ambivalence to summarize about guidelines. If medicine is fundamentally an inquiry for purposes of cure, then guidelines might usurp this method, which is inquiry. So the role of the doctor is neither robotic nor about exercising judgment. The role of the doctor is as part of, fundamentally, a very large collective inquiry. And the doctor's role is to engage meaningfully and engage the individual patient's illness with that. That's why we want to know what we've got, even if we can't cure it, famously. And cosmopolitanism means you've got to have a consultative approach and all that good stuff. And it's not just a nice to have. I think that's what I want to say. It's actually essential to the epistemic stance. It's not just like, these are what the guys say. Oh yeah, we've got to be nice about how we implement it. It's actually central. Otherwise, they can be counterproductive. And guidelines could stymie practical progress by creating disagreement. Actually, creating disagreement because of the fact people disagree more easily about principles than about cases, if that is a fact, which I think it is. Thank you very much.